صلوا على محمد وعلى محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
ثانيا على أصوات
صل على محمد وآل محمد.
الثالثة بأعلى على أصوات
محمد وآل محمد.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين حمدا دائما سرمدا يزيد ولا ينقطع أبدا، ثم الصلاة والسلام على حبيبه وصفيه سيد الأولين والآخرين سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله الطاهرين المعصومين المنتجبين. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آله. السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك. عليك مني سلام الله أبدا وبقيت وبقي الليل والنهار، ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. عظم الله أجورنا وأجوركم بمصاب سيد الشهداء أبي عبد الله الحسين عليه الصلاة والسلام. Sisters and brothers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. قال أمير المؤمنين عليه الصلاة والسلام في خطبة له: اللهم إنك تعلم أنه لم يكن الذي كان منا منافسة في سلطان ولا التماس شيء من فضول الحطام، ولكن لنرد المعالم من دينك ونظهر الإصلاح في بلادك، فيأمن المظلومين أو المظلومون من عبادك، وتقام المعطلة من حدودك. O Lord, you know that our acceptance of leadership was not to wrestle with power or eagerness for some material benefit. It is to bring back and re-establish the principles of your faith and to reform the social structure that has been broken, so that those who have been wronged feel safe and the discontinued of your own commandment will be reintroduced. This is Khutbah 131 in Nahj al-Balagh. Although Amir al-Mu'mineen salawatullah salamu alayhi used this sermon to outline the values that underscored his leadership. Why did he accept the leadership after the demise of the Holy Prophet and nearly 25 years later? The value that mattered to him was clearly outlined. Primarily, it is not for the sake of challenging or wrestling power with anybody else or some material gain. The values that underscore or that going to be the basis that of importance for this new administration are: number one, the narid al-ma'alim min dinek, so that we can re-establish the principles of your faith, and to reform the social structure that has been broken and has become dysfunctional. Once you do this, what happens? So that those who have been wronged, mazlumun, within the society, they feel safe that their rights are protected. The marginalized, disgruntled, these people that the structure doesn't consider them, they feel safe. And the discontinued of your commandment will be reintroduced, the principles of faith. Imam Hussain salawatullah wasalam alayhi uses the same narrative to outline the reason for his uprising. Very close in the words of this, that the reasons for his uprising and his challenge to the political social structure that existed on the day was exactly what his father outlined in his introduction of what the new system, what his administration is going to deal with. The values that were worthy for him enough to give his life for it. Last night, as the intro into the themes that I'm going to discuss, I posed a number of questions. And I stated that although the commemoration of Imam Hussain and Ashura has become instinctive in at least the Shia community, in all of its different denominations. The moment the Hilal of the month of Muharram arrives, there is a zeal that to organize a commemoration, draping of the centers and everything else. Speakers are invited and the plans are there to talk about Ashura. Imam Hussain moved from Medina to Kufa, to Mecca, and there towards Karbala. However, despite all of these, fundamental questions remained unanswered. And the result of all these commemorations has not done much to improve our knowledge of Imam Hussain, in-depth knowledge, not superficial. And those who stood by him in the uprising and made up whatever information we have is extremely sketchy and superficial and shallow. I pointed out that we have to contextualize Ashura and the uprising of Ashura within the parameter of the eternal conflict between Haqq and Batil that started from Prophet Adam and will continue to the end of time. The first example was between Adam and Iblis, and this continues. And I cited a verse in the Holy Quran that clearly underlines this constant conflict between the Imams, or those who are going to guide society to the right path, and those who are opposed. Call it the Musas of the time, the prophets of the time, and the pharaohs of the time, the wealthy of the time. In the context of Musa, it was Pharaoh, but in the context of the Holy Prophet, it is Abu Sufyan. In the context of Ali, it becomes Muawiyah. In the context of Hussain, it becomes Yazid. So there is this conflict, constant conflict between these two. I promise that tonight I'm going to focus on a critical or crucial question of who is Hussain, understanding the character of Imam Hussain. Without having a clear understanding of Imam Hussein's character, we will have either an incomplete view of Karbala or a contorted, distorted image of Imam Hussain. Particularly when we have in our hadith being mentioned, as soon as Karbala comes and Ashura comes, Sayyiduna Yazid qatala Sayyiduna al-Hussain. Or in the case of Safin, Sayyiduna Muawiyah haraba ma'a Sayyiduna Ali. When both of these individuals are put on equal level, how can we, what are the critical themes that we have to use to distinguish between which Sayyidina is fabricated and which Sayyidina is true? Which Sayyidina becomes the image of evil and which Sayyidina becomes the image of haqq and justice? This is a critical issue. So, to understand that, I need to introduce and engage two questions or two themes. Number one, Ashura was 1,400 years ago, so we call it as part of history. What is our view as Muslims of history? How can, and historical events, can we as human beings have a role to play in shaping or forming of contemporary history as well as the future? Or no, history is somehow some kind of historical jabber or predestination that we have no role to play. As Marx said, that history repeats itself. Do we really have to witness constantly the repeat of history in the negative sense? Or can we as human beings change the dynamics of history, both contemporary and the future? That's one thing that we need to discuss. And the second one that we really need to understand, how can we recognize what we call great historical figures? Figures of the past, that we were not present during their time, and we are left with some narratives, anecdotal narratives or recording of history, and we want to bring that image back so that we understand, at least to a degree. There is a debate that historical events of the past and historical characters, major historical figures, cannot be clearly envisaged and understood, particularly when their nature, their characteristics become complex. We can talk about Bernard Shaw, Shakespeare, we can talk about some philosophers, Aristotle, etc., etc. But talk about Amir al-Mu'mineen salawatullah alayhi, and you fail. Immediately, you have to admit the information and all the narratives available to try to explain this complex reality does not give justice to the character that we want to understand. Hadith is quite clear. Ya Ali, nobody understood Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the way Allah deserves to be understood but me and you. Number two, nobody understood me as the last messenger, the seal of the prophethood, but Allah and you. And nobody understood who you are but Allah and me. With this hadith, clearly it tells us that the project of dealing with complete understanding of the character of Amir al-Mu'mineen is almost impossible. But does that mean we should just drop the project because it's impossible and say, well, throw in the towel, we can't do much? No. The same thing goes with Imam Hussain, Imam Hassan, and others. Let's go back to the issue of and see what Quran talks about the history. Quran does not accept that historical events are pure accident, that must happen predetermined, jabr, outside the human control. This is rejected. On the contrary, Quran clearly states that if humans act according to their given intellectual vision, the verse in the Holy Quran, لَهُمْ قُلُوبٌ لَا يَفْقَهُونَ بِهَا. The heart is not just this flesh that pumps blood. It's the inner reality. لَهُمْ قُلُوبٌ, that intellectual vision that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granted every human being, that can be used to establish what is going on around. If we don't use it, then naturally we are compelled to see, to witness the repeat of history in a cycle. So history repeats itself if we don't take our responsibilities properly. The concept of Imam of the time and pharaohs of the time or evils of the time is part of this dynamic. If Ali failed, and we have a number of ahadith and commentaries from him, that the Holy Prophet told me, Ya Ali, if you get enough people to stand up with you and defend, rise. But if you don't, be patient. So Ali had to be patient. Why? Because the entire community, after the demise of the Holy Prophet, only 5 people stood up with Ali: Salman, Miqdad, Abu Dhar, and few others. The rest decided that the comfort zone is much better for them. We are tired. Now we want to live. So he had no other alternative. If Imam Hassan, the question that was last night, was compelled to sign a peace treaty with Muawiyah not because he wanted it. In his answer to people who criticized him, he said, if I hadn't done that, these few individuals that are left of what we call true believers would have been massacred and totally destroyed. So the elite of the day decided not to stand up and support justice. If Imam Hussein's uprising failed, at least on the material sense, to secure the goals that it had to do, it's because people, the Muslims, the Shias, the followers of Ahlul Bayt, and so on, didn't want to stand up and support it. Or at least most of them, going back to the issue of understanding Ma'rifatul Imam, they really had no Ma'rifah of the Imam at all. Shem, they say, historians claim that between 15 or 16 or 10 or 12 times walked barefooted from Medina to Mecca to go to Hajj. He was part of Amir al-Mu'mineen salawatullah salam alayhi's army in Siffin, fighting Muawiyah. He was injured. Had he been killed there, we would stand here behind this podium and we say, may God for mercy be on the soul of Shem, because he was one of the Sahaba at the time. What happened? The transition took place because lack of ma'rifah of the Imam and the challenge of material life. Quran says you can change your history. History does not have to repeat itself if we don't want to. History will repeat itself if we want to. Humans are capable of learning from the historical events and our experiences if we understand the divine law and embedded in the shaping of history, Sunnatullah. The verse in the Holy Quran, Sunnatullah allati qad khalat min qabl wa lan tajida li sunnatillahi tabdila. There are fundamental principles that govern history, divine principles that govern history. But they are contingent, not absolute. They are contingent on a number of facts. One of them is what we as human beings rise and decide to do. إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِقَوْمٍ حَتَّى يُغَيِّرُوا مَا بِأَنفُسِهِمْ. So we as human beings have to navigate between the two dynamic paradigms. Be conscious of the fact that there are some divine laws that Allah says, Sunnatullah, that dictates. And at the same time, those laws predicated rests on our own standing up and supporting justice and injustice. If we don't defend justice, naturally injustice takes over. Abu Bakr succeeded in taking over because nobody stood up to him. Omar did the same, nobody said the same. Uthman, a classic example of failure of leadership, they all accepted it and said nothing. So when dhulm takes over, one of the ahadith, اَأْمُرُوا بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَانْهُوا عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ أَوْ لَسَلَّطَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْكُمْ شِرَارَكُمْ فَيَدْعُوا خِيَارَكُمْ فَلَا يُسْتَجَابُ. To encourage people to do good. Discourage them from doing evil. Oh, if not, we don't do that, the wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will come, and once the wrath comes, does not recognize the guilty or the not guilty. Why? Because we didn't stand up to injustice. We are all guilty by default. The ball is going to take over. So we as human beings can lead and change our history, can be influential in our history. Not only now, for the future. We stand now and we look back 1,400 years or so, or even 200 years ago, or 100 years ago, and we make a judgment as to whether X, Y, and Z in the past didn't do the right, and consequence was whatever. Our history, future history will judge us, whether we failed or not in dealing with our responsibilities here. So not only that, we go back to another issue. By the way, those of you who are interested in reading about this, Shaykh Muhammad Baqir Sadr has a book, السنن التاريخية والفلسفة الاجتماعية في المدرسة القرآنية. It's a thick book that he analyzes this relationship between history and human being, the role of history, how we can influence history in the past, contemporary, and the future. It's a series of lectures that he gave in Najaf, and they are all compiled under this title. I believe it's been translated. One of the fundamental questions, and both Shaykh Mutahari has and others. Another one is that the role of leadership. So history needs two components to reform itself. Pure leaders and zealous individuals that they understand their responsibility properly and they are prepared to stand up. Remember the hadith? The obedience is due. When Imam says, I recited this hadith last night, that part of Tawheed, understanding God, is understanding the Imam of your time, the Imam al-Asr, and submitting to the command of the Imam and following their guidelines. It's not just to come to the masajid, marakis, and so on, do majalis and so on. Commemoration that lacks ma'rifatul Imam, commemoration that doesn't speak of our responsibility, is nothing but superficial, what I call it, knee-jerk reaction to the first month of the year. So we need the leadership as well as an active, zealous community that deals with understand their responsibility properly. Now we go, how do we recognize leaders? Leaders of truth, leaders of justice. There are two ways. Number one, the narrative, historical narrative that explain Hassan was this, Hussain was that, Ali was this, Fatima was this, the Holy Prophet. Give us some narrative about their life. Even if they were extensively available, they would fail to explain the complexity of the nature of these individuals. So narrative and historical stories and biographical recording are not doing justice to the fact. The other step that we can use is the value system that these individuals considered close to their heart, and they were prepared to give their lives for these values. When it comes to Ahlul Bayt, I think it's better to use the value system rather than the narrative that exists, because even our historical books, they do not fill the gap between. When I'm talking about narrative, not narrative just purely the biological one or biographical one. He was the son of this, was born in such and such a time, and then under the auspices of the grandfather, then mother, then father's period of, and then ultimately we get to Karbala. That doesn't shed much picture of the character of Hussain. What was Hussain when it came to standing up before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the mystical dimension of Hussain? Go and read Dua Arafah and see how he weeps. Tomorrow night, inshallah, we'll talk about this. Absolute submission before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That I have nothing if you don't give it to me. Total dependency on Allah. What about his social and political stance during this period? What about his education and teaching stance in this period? What did he do? It's the value system that we have to talk about. In the lecture that I gave about the life of Imam Rida salawatullah salam alayhi, Imam Rida said, Rahimallah abdan ahya amruna. فقلت له, this is from one of the disciples of Imam Rida, فقلت له وكيف يحيى أمركم يا ابن رسول الله؟ قال يتعلم علومنا ويعلمها الناس فإن الناس لو علموا محاسن كلامنا لاتبعونا. There is a degree of amnesia. People really don't know anything about us as a consequence of everything that the rulers have done. So if you want to be a Shia, learn يتعلم علومنا, the knowledge of Ahlul Bayt, and go and give it to other people. The historical narratives or biographical narratives are good enough for people who have no idea about Islam whatsoever. You can give a, this is a revolutionary leader, was born on such and such a date, and etc. etc. But to mobilize the community, to rise and stand up for justice, for the values that Imam Hussain lost his life for or gave his life for, then it's not enough. So humans are capable of changing the reality. What are the values? The concept of value in understanding the character of human being is clearly something that we have talked in the past, but Amir al-Mu'mineen salawatullah salam alayhi, in one of the short sayings says, قِيمَةُ كُلُّ امْرَئٍ مَا يُحْسِنُهُ. People have interpreted in a classical way that the worth of somebody depends on the knowledge that he acquires. Marhum Allama Ja'fari disagrees with this interpretation. He said, I attended a conference in Switzerland or Germany, wherever it was, and at the end of the conference, a question was posed. What is the worth of human being? Do we have certain criteria to establish humans are worth X, Y, and Z? Everybody said something. When it came to my turn, I recited this saying from Amir al-Mu'mineen salawatullah salam alayhi, and said the worth of human being depends on what you struggle for and endeavor in your life. If you endeavor to have a house, that's the worth. If you endeavor to find a job from 9 to 5 and earn a living and then go back home and sit and do nothing, that's your worth. If you're searching the American dreams and you're talking about millions or something, then that's your worth. But if God is the objective, Akhirah is the objective, and then فَإِنْ زُحْزِحَ عَنِ النَّارِ وَأُدْخِلَ الْجَنَّةِ فَقَدْ فَازَ is the one that we are thinking about, then it's a totally different worth. So if we want to judge the values that Ahlul Bayt fought for, worth, you see what are the values that they consider to be extremely important, and Imam Hussain is prepared to give his life for the sake of those values. Establishment of justice, restructuring social community where poor and the needy find a resource that they can rely upon. People have their rights protected. The leaders are equal with the community, with individuals within the community. Where you have sympathy for the poor, the needy, and so on. Look at the wasiyah of Amir al-Mu'mineen salawatullah salamu alayhi to Imam Hassan. Allah, Allah, fi nadhm amr, starts. Organize yourself. Then Quran, then Salat, Allah, Allah fil aytam. The orphans, the poor, and the needy. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will question you with social responsibility. It's not just, well, I'm okay, I'm doing fine, that's it. No. At the end of the day, if we really care about the day of judgment and the akhirah, these are questions that we have to answer. These are the values that are critical. So, this approach gives us a better picture or a better methodology of establishing who Hussain is. By looking at the values, how those values shaped his life, and how those values must be critical for us in outlining them during the period of Muharram and commemoration. When Muhammad ibn Hanafiya, his half-brother, comes in front of him that go and hide somewhere, and look what he responds to him. Abdullah ibn Umar comes to him and says, don't cause discontent and just be peaceful and stay in Medina and accept it. And what Imam says, respond to Abdullah ibn Umar. Abdullah ibn Ja'far, Sayyidah Zainab's husband, comes with the same thing. These are close family members of Imam Hussain that they really lack true ma'rifah of Imam of the time. What are the values that Imam Hussain stood for? And outlined during the time that he moved from Medina to ultimately Karbala, constantly in the slogans that he talks about, these values are clearly outlined. Now, those values are the one that we can say, do these values intrinsically, pure as they are, can become the judge between establishing Sayyiduna Yazid and Sayyiduna Hussain. Which one is the evil, which one is the good? A society that doesn't matter whether it's Sayyiduna Yazid, despite the fact that they all know who Yazid was. And they are not prepared to stand up to allow Hussain to take over. Or for them before, whether it's Muawiyah or Ali, it didn't matter. Whether it's Abu Bakr or Ali, it didn't matter. That society, when a society lives or wants to live in paradox and contradiction, there is a fundamental problem that we have to address. And unfortunately, we see that paradox existing in our society. We come to the mosque during Muharram, beat our chests, and possibly cry for a few minutes, and then go out as if nothing has happened. That's why last night I said that the first question we need to ask ourselves, between last Muharram and this Muharram, how much of our time or our character has changed and got closer to the values of Ahlul Bayt? If we haven't, then there is an issue. Inshallah, tomorrow night we will focus on these values, and from them establish the character as much as possible. I must admit it's very difficult, but with as much as possible within this kind of navigating between the values, establish a picture of Imam Hussain and why it's so critical for us to follow him. As every year it happens that people send me from other places, not necessarily here. They say that please ask those who are present to recite Amman Yujib for, and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant speedy recovery to those who are sick, ill, and they are really searching for some kind of prayer for their crisis to be resolved. So let us join everyone together and recite Amman Yujib, inshallah, and then we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us the privilege of being among the followers, true followers of Ahlul Bayt, and we end with Fatiha. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Amman yujibu al-mutarra idha da'a. Amman yujibu al-mutarra idha da'a. Amman yujibu al-mutarra idha da'a. أمن يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء أمن يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء. O Lord, ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive our sins and to grant a speedy recovery to those who are sick, ill, and need of help, and those who have difficulties in their life. Inshallah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will resolve them. Let's end. Tonight is Laylat al-Jum'ah by reciting Surah Al-Fatiha على روح أمواتنا جميعا قبل الصلاة على محمد وآل محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.